Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the wizard in glass of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka, you know it's a really heavy band? Blue Cheer.
Oh god.
I've probably done that bit before, but I'll probably do it twice a year forever.
You know, although last summer I did listen to the Blue Cheer demo.
Yeah?
Like the Summertime Blues demo. That shit is killer.
Is it actually good?
It's crushing, and it sounds... The studio recordings are just shit compared to them. The studio recordings are all terrible. They sound like The Who, but worse. The demo sounds like fucking noisecore, but slow. It's awesome.
So we're saying the demos were better even for proto-metal bands in the 60s.
Yes. I'm sorry, but it's true. I'm not sorry. And on that note, I am the black metal guy, a.k.a. medieval porno grind band.
Could you elaborate on what is happening in your mind's eye right now?
Imagine the song title potential. You get sort of like gangbanged by cum homunculi.
That's solid. I have
it's inspired in part. I've taken some influence there.
I have been sitting on a song title "Raped to Death by Centaurs" for several years now. So.
That's for the sort of that's the sort of like gore grind kind of gore grind GBK crossover.
Well, I don't know who is it. I was hanging out with somebody the other day, and we were talking about the idea of, like, what if you did wizard grind, where you're doing, like, epic Dorian scale melodies, but played, like, hyperspeed sawing Napalm Death style? You know, just 45-second songs about smiting Balrogs and shit.
I mean, that's basically how I write black metal when I write it in 4/4. When it's not in Graveland triplets, that's how it sounds.
So that's the move. Okay. Yeah. I think we definitely have to.
It's just 3 minutes long and it never stops.
Yeah, well, for us, it's like 45 seconds. It's like, pick the big Dorian melody, just go way too fast.
Okay, well, it's a pretty good concept.
Yeah, wizard grind. You know, we need a new core. Speaking of core, let's do a show. Let's talk about our first record of the night. A leadenly core stalwart, as I've come to refer to this style. We've got the new record by Father Befouled titled Crowned in Veneficum, out on Everlasting Spew Records. If anyone's wondering at home, yes, I did look up how to pronounce that word before coming onto the show.
Yeah, nice one. What does that mean?
It's just like old-timey word for poison. You know, so like crowned in poison or, plague.
Solid.
Yeah, so Father Befouled is a band that I've talked about a fair amount on the show because I'm a pretty big fan of them. And you've never heard like a full record. Have you even heard a song by them before?
I don't think so. They're just a central Terminus reference point for, Yeah, they've come up in the Pro Sanctus reviews. They've come up, in a lot of that stuff we were covering last summer, like Upon the Altar and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit of background for people. So Father Befouled are from Georgia. The members of the band are in all sorts of other things. Like one of the guitarists is also in Thos Ayala, whose first record we covered last year. One or two of the guys now. Yeah, I think it's both of the members of Incantation are in Father Befouled.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and they've got, another 12.5 projects spread between them. So these are all pretty prolific musicians. But Father Befouled has, for about the past 15 years, been seemingly the primary band for all of them. So this is kind of interesting. I have to do like a brief rant, stop me if it goes too long, but just in prep, I was kind of curious. I was looking at old reviews of Father Befouled records, just seeing what the critical opinion was. And what's interesting is a lot of people like Father Befouled, but they're not especially warmly received critically. I just kept...
So, like, Metal Archives likes them, but critics don't.
Actually, no. Metal Archives is, like, semi-warm on them, but not a whole lot. What I found weird was people were constantly saying, Oh, it sounds like Incantation. It sounds like Incantation. This is just... And the thing that actually, like, got my goat that I had to talk about was people saying, oh, it's just another Incantation clone. Well, here's the thing, guys. A little bit of a history lesson. So, in the mid-2000s, when we were coming up, Incantation was basically fucking dead, and very few people were listening to Incantation. The first Father Befouled record came out in 2008 alongside Dead Congregation's Grave of the Archangels, and then the first Prosanctus and Fairy record came out a couple years after that in 2010. What you're hearing isn't just another Incantation clone. This is one of the bands that created the wave of Incantation clones that you're all sick of now. These are some of the first guys, in this era who went back to Incantation in a really significant way and started playing with those sounds. Before that, the Incantation style of death metal had basically been dead for almost 10 years. I mean, Father Befouled were instrumental in bringing that back alongside Dead Congregation, Prosanctus and Fairy, and this big list of kind of Midwestern and Southern bands that were...
There was some Australian band, but I forget their name.
Not Titan Blood, right?
No, Titan Blood I think are Spanish or Portuguese.
Oh, for some reason I thought they were... Yeah, whatever. But anyway...
Spanish.
Yeah. So that just drove me insane. It's what's fascinating is so few people know the history. They think that Father Befouled is part of that wave of imitators, when really they were instrumental in establishing a style. This sort of neo-incantation style. And additionally, it doesn't just sound like fucking Incantation. There's a lot more beyond Incantation that sounds like. What it really sounds like is kind of a agglutinative idea of all of Paul Ledney's early stuff. So there, of course, you have Incantation, but you've got Profanatica, and you've got Havohe. And especially in Father Befouled's later material, you've got these big streaks of sort of modern doom stuff that even Incantation never fully explored. So... to wrap it up, yes, obviously this sounds substantially like Incantation, but don't get this confused for a band that came out 3 years ago and started doing this. They're the reason those other bands exist.
Yeah, indeed, that's the confusing thing, is that because there's something original about it, because they were distilling the Incantation sound into... because they were distilling all the Ledney projects into this synthesized blasting Incantation thing, they helped create the, they helped kind of create the, like, the thing that's become pastiche, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, in some way, this sounds to me, I mean, I hadn't actually heard on Radical Goth until we listened to it for the show a couple years ago, but, but this sounds, if you listen to this and just be like, what does this sound like? It sounds more like the various kinds of incantation worship or cavern core style bands than Incantation itself. However, that's because they all ripped off the synthesis these guys created.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean...
because it doesn't really sound like dry early 90s. Oh, pardon me. We've got a canine guest. He's just chilling now. Hey. What? I'm recording this episode of Terminus from my girl's place. And so I've got...
And Ozzy Pawsborn is freaking out a little bit.
Sorry.
No, he's all good.
Right on the fly.
Yeah, that was pretty good, dude.
But yeah, no, so you're totally correct when you say that. It's like, people are, in many ways, responding to a synthesis that they don't realize that Father Befouled, as well as a lot of other bands, basically helped create. And at this point, I would say that this whole style, there is no term for it, but the sort of old school U.S. Black Death style, if you want to give it a laborious term, is really kind of a style of its own at this point. We've gone far enough down the rabbit hole of Profanatica and Havohe and Incantation and all these kind of, and Von and all these germinal kind of U.S. black meets death metal ideas. It's really become a scene in and of itself. And Father Befouled is one of the flagships, so I was really excited to talk about the new one. So... take a breath. You, as someone who's really fresh to this, I'll talk about how I think this relates to the rest of their discography, but what are your initial impressions finally hearing the band that I talk about so much?
Well, my initial impressions were, first listen through, did not immediately catch me, right? But I was listening in the knowledge that this is a band that is important, in the ways that you've just discussed. And I knew if they're this important to the death metal guy, they've got to be doing this style in a standout way, right? When I first listened to it, I expected it to sound more unlike the wave of successive sort of incantation worship caverncore bands, right? So when I first listened to it, I'm like, oh, this kind of sounds like those. But and what struck me is the blast riffs are they are not big, long, sort of super twisted riffs in the style of Onward to Golgotha, right? They're very much stripped back. So certain, and if you're a black metal person, or even just a person who's steeped in this kind of later, highly black metal-ized death metal stuff, right? You're going to expect the trem riffs to be the big riffs. I was not getting that, but a lot of the doom stuff you mentioned, oddly, right? Because you know me, I tend to be doom skeptical. A lot of the big slow parts that really do sound like doom metal in a way were more clearly marked in the music to me, and I was able to get my hooks in them. I was able to sort of they almost had more physical heft and gut emotional heft than the blasting parts. Then when I heard that, I'm like, okay, I'm getting something about this, and I didn't love it the first time through, but let me play it again. When I played it again, I start to hear more cool stuff in the blasting parts, and I start to be able to discern more what makes these guys good at and sort of founders of this particular style. I got more out of the blast riffs on the second go, and I just was able to start hearing how they played as a band, which is very different from a lot of people doing more formulaic takes on these styles.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with the whole assessment there. And I really want to draw attention to you talking about the importance and the definition of the doom parts, because for this record in particular, I would say this is almost primarily a doom death record. Which is interesting, coming right off the back of us reviewing that Rotting Kingdom and Coffination split a couple episodes ago. So listening to this, it feels like the blast parts aren't insignificant, but they are directive. They are very clearly and specifically ways to get to the meat of these songs, which in most cases are these sort of elaborate doom parts. And what I think is interesting, and what I'll keep coming back to as we review this, is the really aggressive contrast between how sort of primitive and elemental the trem riffs are and how elaborate and unfolding the doom parts are. And that's a little bit jarring at first, but I think after listening a couple times, that's part of the intent, is to have these almost hypnotic, looping, chromatic, or just like simple death metal minor figures that, spill out into these really vast passages. It's structurally a little bit more ambitious than it appears on first listen. And I think that as I listen to this more, I'll get even more out of it. But so as not to, just stare up my own asshole, let's get to samples for a bit.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with His Throne Decayed. This is the first part where on my first listen through, I was like, oh, this is cool. And it's one of these doom parts where I'm gonna start it right from the beginning. No, sorry, it's well into I am starting this from the beginning. Sorry, I got a different recording environment, slightly scattered. Focus in as the show goes. So we've got it's an A-B phrase. It's an A-B riff, right? First phrase, second phrase. and we're gonna get into the big doom part and listen to the timing, especially when they shift from the A to the B variation and then back to the beginning. So as they turn around each phrase, the timing is really strange, and it's going to start off without any drums under it at all, or the drums not doing a driving thing at all. Yeah, so I'm going to come back to this with the next sample too, but as those iterations of the riff trade at the beginning, they kind of overlap one another. Mm-hmm. Do you hear that?
Yeah.
Like, are they trading between guitars or channels?
They're trading between channels, and the whole thing is arranged in 7/4. But I think the second guitar is like starting a couple bars later, so you've got this like contrasting, like interlocking at different points, odd time flow to it. So it makes it seem even more complicated.
Yeah, and a standard cavern core band or whatever playing a riff like that would play. It would be like a quarter note kind of melody, right? They would just really, it would be almost stiflingly even in how it's delivered. A lot of those bands have that grid-written feel, right? Mm-hmm. They're just this drawn-out full quarter or half notes on trem. And here, they seem to be like hurrying and delaying certain notes in a way that makes it stutter off from your expectations. And that is very effective in these slow parts where you're not looking for that sort of thrust and drive you get in the blast parts.
Yeah. There's the doom parts on this record are really expansive in a way that's been kind of hinted at before by this band, but they really go all out on this record, and that's a really good way to segue into my first sample. This is off the track right before the one you're playing. What you're playing is kind of the instrumental coda to this song, Miasmas of Sodom. So we're going to go to the beginning of this track, and this is kind of a microcosm of the record. You're going to have a couple really ugly sort of Profanatica-style riffs to open things up, get the energy high, and then very quickly, actually, it's going to recede into some stuff that actually reminds me a lot of that Incantation split that we covered.
What?
Sorry?
Wait, dude, is your time... I think you've got Miasmas of Sodom written in the notes, but the timestamp is for Dethroned Enslavement.
You are correct. I was writing up my notes while I was working today. You're right. It is, in fact, Dethroned Enslavement that we're going to listen to.
All right.
Yeah, so something I forgot to mention before we went into that is the lead guitar work on this record is really important. It's almost kind of the narrative center of a lot of these songs. Most of the big doom passages on this record are going to be centered around a sort of elaborate solo passage, and it tends to be sort of a fusion of like cryptopsy and funeral doom in the way that it's laid out.
Yeah, it is a little bit funeral doomy. What makes it like cryptopsy?
Oh, I just think certain aspects of the phrasing, you get that sort of like weird Victorian romantic feel that you'll get off of None So Vile,
but also a bit like a shredding guitar solo. In the way that something like cryptopsy might.
Mm-hmm. It's got flash, but it's also very clearly and steadily plotted out. These are not just throwing your fingers across the fretboard. These are arranged in very distinct phrases.
Yeah, it's not random blues licks, but it is genealogically related to hard rock and heavy metal solos that were random blues licks.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the guitarist from Thos-Aiella is the guy doing most of the solos on this.
That would make sense, yeah.
Because you're right, there's a lot of sort of blues phrasing that you'll hear tucked away that we heard a lot on the Thos-Aiella record as well. So.
Yeah, that's a thing in a lot of early 90s death metal records that will surprise people who aren't death metal people, right? Because a lot of those bands still had this concept of the virtuosic solo that was preserved from earlier stuff.
Yeah, it's all kind of like Slayer descent, how much of the stuff that's not purely chromatic when it comes to their leads is usually kind of pentatonic. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, so that's kind of a microcosm of the record. You'll have these, those are really simple riffs up front, those trem riffs. Actually simpler than a lot of previous Father Befouled stuff. It feels like they deliberately pared things down. One thing that I think they probably took note of was the last Prosanctus record, Hypnotic Blood Art. That is obviously more power chord based and even more stripped down, but given that Jake, the main guy from Prosanctus, was actually in Father Befouled for a little bit, as well as the original drummer from Prosanctus who passed away. I think, those bands have always been deeply connected and paying attention to each other's work, I believe.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting you said that one was that was very stripped down, because as I listened again here, there's still a lot of subtlety in the blast riffs. They almost go through, you know how when we reviewed Absu for the bonus episode, you were kind of complaining about the rote 1-4 blues alternations?
Yeah.
Chord progression alternations, right? Which, to be fair, yeah, are a weak point and a lot of thrash influenced stuff, right? They did almost like a parody of that here. Where they played the same trem riff, maybe it was even up a fourth, but when they repeat it in the chord chain, in the key change up, they actually change the notes in every iteration of the riff. I think both, they play A, B, then they go up, they do a chord change, a chord or key change, and then they play like A prime, B prime. When they should be repeating it. They're just like, the whole thing has the notes rearranged in weird ways. At least if I heard it right. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that if you dig in, because the production is kind of deliberately... Father Befouled, their production's always been kind of deliberately cool, like a little bit quieter than you would expect from a band like this. And I think that tucks away some sort of weird harmonic stuff happening between the guitars that it comes out on subsequent listens. Yeah. So what do you got next?
Well, speaking of Pro Sanctus, here's a part that really reminded me of Hypnotic Blood Art and, of Pro Sanctus in general. This is on Catabatic Deliverance, and, Catabasis, obviously the sort of descent to and ascent out of the underworld. Right, descent to Hades for mystic knowledge. But you, starting with the blast riff, and that will give people a sense of how spare a lot of these blast riffs are. You may hear the blast riff and think, this is a lot like other blast riffs in the sort of more caverny bands that have proliferated since these guys started. Then you're going to have another 6 slow part that sounds very Pro Sanctus. All right, so towards the end there, we got another one of those big lead moments. But so the thing that relates that to Pro Sanctus a lot is these, heavy snare to bass kind of things, downbeat double bass rolls. It gives it that very authoritative sound. Is that a feature that is Prosanctus innovated, or is that something that was already in the original Ledney projects that that guy accentuated and brought out?
I don't think you heard that so much in Ledney. I think Prosanctus brought a lot of that out, but also, I just think of that as the bolt thrower beat, really.
Oh, it's definitely kind of a bolt thrower beat for sure.
Yeah, well, they would double up the snare, so it's but
yeah, exactly. It's a little different.
Yeah, but no, the really authoritative like snare on the one, and then just like the big looming passage of double kick after that before the next snare hit. Yeah, I'd say Prosanctus did a lot of that. Yeah. But something that's also interesting is I heard another one of those sort of thrash style modulations you were talking about, but I was noticing they're splitting it off so it becomes a harmony, and it's a really weird, ugly harmony. It's like
Was that in the slow part or the fast part leading up to it?
The fast part leading up to it. The guitars split off. You think that it's like, oh, we're just switching to, going a string up or something. But no, it's like a really weird, like, third harmony or something especially distressing to the ear. So.
Oh, and the original riff keeps going underneath it.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. We approve of that.
Well, there's also, listening, again, especially when you hear some of these riffs, part of the reason this record sounds so kind of odd and alienating, I think, is because the guitar tone is so bizarre. It's like not very saturated with gain. It's almost like they're using sort of retro fuzz pedals, like overdriven. It's super midsy, kind of like thin and flabby. It's a really unique sound. It's very unusual. They've always had kind of weird guitar tones, but they really took that to the next level on this. And it's like, I'm surprised they get that effect in the trem riffs without sacrificing any of the heaviness when they get to the actual doom parts.
Yeah, I couldn't describe that as thin and flabby. Maybe just because I'm used to listening to black metal, but it's
different standards.
It's definitely kind of wobbly.
Yeah, it's very wobbly. It's like
it's not a bludgeoning tone. Prosanctus on Hypnotic Blood Art, right? That just sounds like getting hit with a continuous brick, right? A blood brick that kind of bends. And then, I don't know, what's another kind of incantation-based thing, something like fucking Disma, which is flabby but thick like a whale.
I guess I would say this sounds like, because these guys aren't tuned especially low, they're probably in like C or something, but it feels like they're using like 9 gauges in C or something, so you're getting like that sort of loose, sludgy tone of like a really loose string when you're down tuning super far, but without the bass presence you would expect from that. So it's a very strange overall effect.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a little bit watery, right?
Yeah. It's almost like when
so they're using loose. Not only is it down tuned, they are using strings that are looser than they would need to be, or that are lighter gauge than they would need to be.
I think so. I think that's a deliberate thing. Like you can hear even when they're just hanging on to a note in a trem riff. It's like you can sort of hear the pitch wobbling in it, like it's kind of having trouble keeping up with itself, which is usually a sign of a sort of a deliberately loose string. So speaking of fast stuff, my last sample is off the only thing you could really call like a straightforward ripper on this album, which is actually the shortest full song, called Enlightenment of Torture. And here we'll get a little bit more into the relationship to sort of Prosanctus style stuff, because like I said, a lot of these riffs are really elemental, sort of like primitive, even more primitive than early Incantation. But then you've got the sharp, angular stuff that gets brought in from later Prosanctus, and the aggregate effect is something very, very unusual and very sort of upsetting. The coolest part of that for me is where they revisit that. They do the B prime version of that second riff. It starts the same, you think it's going to be the same riff, but it takes a really bizarre sort of angular switch halfway through the riff.
When they with the slow riff, that not the slow one we ended on, right?
No, right before that. Yeah.
Right, where they return to the most straightforward kind of trope of the blasting riffs, right? Mm-hmm. They've gone through the like crazy winding triplet chromatic riff, right? Then they do a crazy winding blast riff in a similar idiom. Then they lock back into the more stripped down riff, and we both cracked up when that re-entered. Because, yeah, something happens where they play it initially, and then they hit one or two chords at the end that make it sound like they're falling down the stairs.
Oh, yeah, there's something really bizarre happens at that moment.
Really awful. And, like, in the best way. Does that repeat on any of the subsequent iterations? Because I was listening for it and I didn't hear it.
It does. It's bizarre because they do it like twice, then they do the standard version once, and then they do the altered version again. It's really weird and off balance. There's also something strange going on where there's a lot of like odd-numbered repetitions happening. Throughout this. Like, riffs are not repeating in sets of 4 and 8, even when they're 4/4 riffs. They're throwing in an extra measure or they're dropping one off. It's super weird. Like, there's a lot of... I think if you really sit down and listen to this and plot it out beat by beat, there's some really odd things happening just under the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot of memory that's gone into writing these songs.
Yeah, and I also think that I've got a feeling that this was probably recorded live to a degree. At least like guitars and drums were recorded together, and probably vocals and bass overdubbed. Maybe all the instruments played together. There's these odd little hiccups in timing. I don't think this was done to a click track. I think they just played these a bunch and went in and kind of laid these out. So you get the kind of jam room sense of certain bands, but in this really sort of rigorous Black Death framework. And the result is there's something really off-putting about this music, like in a good way, you know? It's like there is something just weird about it, not even in the troped, oh, you know, this is so dark and evil way of just like there's something inherently wrong with what's going on at any given moment of the record. And that, at least to me, I find that very heartwarming.
All right, and we are back with Sepulkral Dedication by Lifvsleda on Norma Evangelium Diaboli. So, this is... I didn't know this project existed till pretty recently, or it had like barely registered in the back of my mind. But this is a project where the one listed member, right, Sigvard, is also Nattfursth from Sorhin, the vocalist from Sorhin. People who've been listening to this show for a while know that I find any excuse to reference Sorhin a pretty undeservedly obscure, well, kind of deservedly, because it's really extreme, crazy music. Yeah, never mind. Music that was meant to be obscure from Sweden, sort of ripping black metal with undertones of death metal riffiness. Sounds deeply pagan in a sense, but also has strange dissonant harmonies running throughout that make it very different from any of that, and very innovative for the late 90s. The person who reissued the Sorhin records, I think on CD first back in the day, was Christian from Deathspell Omega, the main DSO guy who runs Noevdia, the label that put this out. So there's some established relationship between them. I think he's helped keep the name of that band alive. You can hear their stamp prominently on Infernal Battles, the earliest DSO stuff. And I think some of the later DSO stuff probably owes its feeling, if not the technique, to the second Sorhin record, to Apocalypsen's Angle. But yeah, so this is a guy who has a history with the label. The project itself has no other listed members, which is interesting, right? And we'll come back to that. But first, I guess we should talk about the general flavor of this.
Yeah. So you had talked about this a little bit specifically because it was connected to Sorhin. So, and, I know you, so of course that's going to be a big deal. So I was expecting something that sounded close to Sorhin, which I guess this does occasionally in moments from the admittedly little bit of Sorhin I've heard. But really, there's a case to be made that this is primarily like a DSBM record. The way I see this is sort of like a three-way fusion of very trenchcoat era stuff. This is very 2000 sounding to me. You've got one part DSBM, one part sort of crusty black and roll thing, and one part Swedish Orthodox. But I don't think any of the sources, any of the main influences, are the most obvious ones that you would expect. So the effect you get is something akin to a 2005 DSBM record where the conceit wasn't so firmly established and they weren't so committed to it that every other musical technique was off the table. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's I don't really hear I hear the DSBM thing and the black and roll thing, although those to me almost are just, same picture, right, to some extent. I don't really hear the Swedish Orthodox thing, but you could get here from within Orthodox for sure. Yeah. It's got this, I also was struck by the DSBM thing, immediately. The first track in particular, Sandabudet, starts with these long, drawn-out kind of staggered processional melody. It's 2 or 3 notes that just has big bass shifts under it. And it's immediately really DSBM, and also just kind of sounds like The Cure. It's a kind of rockish gothic melody. Yeah. And the immediate tempo is just
slow and reverent, and kind of it broods intensely from the very beginning. And so that got me thinking, okay, well, this is certainly there's no attempt to make anything that sounds directly like Sorhin, right? This is an entirely separate project. Indeed, Sorhin is still active, and they may at some point release a record. They're never officially disbanded. But yeah, so this is a different beast, and it is certainly... So it's tapping into a different shade of the scenes we associate with Sweden. So what kind of bands were you thinking for the DSBM and black and roll stuff?
So for the DSBM thing, I was trying to hone in on stuff that would make sense for the era that I'm thinking of, like mid to late 2000s. And I think a big source for the DSBM stuff is going to be Total Self-Hatred, who I've talked about a little bit on the show before. Their self-titled 2008 record is sort of, it's hard to describe. It's sort of a bridging moment between those earlier days of DSBM consolidating itself as a scene and the very calcified sort of version that we have now. Hyper melodic, very sad, sort of, it's got those traces of Peaceville doomdeath in it, but it's also not afraid to go fast, to have really aggressive blasting sections and even some like heavy chromatic stuff. So it's really varied. I'd say it's like a second tier classic in DSBM. That was my primary thing there. As well as, it's entirely possible these guys are, they've heard Nyctalgia or Sturband before, stuff like that. You get a little bit of that flavor here and there.
Yeah, and certainly the idea that, the interesting thing, right, is that this guy is of an older generation than the DSBM bands, right? Total Self-Hatred would that be at the same time as Sorhin? Or
no, that'd be later. First demo was in 06, so...
Yeah, and so in the 90s, right, all you'd have of DSBM in particular would be early things that are now associated with it, right? Like Forgotten Woods or Strid. Mm-hmm. That it? Yeah. So that's cool. This is, whatever it is, right, in every single way, this is the record of a guy who has not stopped listening to black metal. Yeah. Right? We should make it clear, there have been some Lifvsleda releases before this. This is not the first. This is the first I've heard, but there was one in 2020, Det Besagrad Livet, and there were some EPs and singles before that. It's been around since 2019. Mm-hmm. But it is, as far as I know, the first time he's really surfaced since the Sorhin days. So he just hasn't stopped listening to shit. There is no attempt to remain narrowly in the aesthetic he established when he was younger, and there's every sense that, there's no sort of like, I'm up here on my pedestal only listening to,
only listening to the same tapes that I had in 91,
Yeah, exactly. Like, I only listen to Venom and, Stravinsky, right? He likes black metal, which is great. So we've got kind of a conspiracy theory about the about the lineup, but I'm thinking maybe let's do one of the samples first, so that we don't hear it with that in mind. Do you want to start with your sample? I've got my two samples are both dedicated to the conspiracy theory. So
yeah, sure. Let's go to my first one. So for me, this is a record where I like the first few songs. I really like that opening song a lot because it's just straight DSBM. But for me, it's on the fourth track where this really starts to heat up, kind of congeal as an album. And that is called Hadenkalad.
Hedankalad? I don't know. I'm going to translate that. That might have something to do with being with heathens, but I'm not sure. I'll translate it while we listen to the sample.
So, like I said, I see this record as being composed of like three kind of distinct ideas of black metal. For a lot of the record, it tends to keep them a little bit separate. They're located in distinct sections, interrelated melodically, but pretty distinct stylistically. Here's an example where all those ideas really merge into a singular whole and become a lot more defining for the band as an entity. Alright, I promise that's the only, like, huge melodic sentimental riff that I pulled on the record. because most of these songs tend to end with one of those. You know, you'll go through a sequence of a lot of different things, and then it'll usually open on the most flourishing and kind of openly emotional riff at the end. And that, on this track, I think this is the best instance of that. That's an outstanding way to wrap
that's a
up the
fantastic
song.
riff.
Yeah, I wish they had played it for, you know, another 8 repetitions and done more lead guitar variations and just gone totally maximalist.
Don't they open the track with that too?
No, actually, what's funny is they open with a really aggressive, surprisingly orthodoxy riff. Yeah, which is...
I mean, yeah, I was honestly surprised. I knew that one had a big riff on it, and I was like, at first with your sample, I was like, wait, he's not doing the big riff?
Well, I was doing the big riff at the end. But yeah, no, it's... So when that sample opens, so I'm basically doing the middle of the song, the back half of it. Mm-hmm. So when it opens, it was interesting because I considered that passage, that arpeggiated passage, kind of orthodoxy, especially when it opens. But then I think it kind of contorts itself through a few different configurations. So you get those flickers of different moods. You get the orthodox stuff, you get the DSBM, and you even get some of the sort of black and roll stuff. And I think this might be a case where these guys are actually serious about Avsky. Because there's moments on this record that feel specifically Avsky, which is a band we've talked about a lot on the show. We got to do a bonus episode about Avsky, apparently.
Yeah, I need to go back and listen to that more. Now. It's yeah, I mean, a modern band. It also reminds me of somewhat is Gjendud.
I can see
who are Norse, who are Norse, but who are drawing heavily on a lot of like Swedish style DSBM ideas and combining them with like very lush stuff that's coming more from Toke, but again, sort of converges with the Swedes.
Yeah.
And so what do you... Yeah, so you've got the sort of chiming, droning stuff, and then, you know, the it drops into a blast part that's more kind of grinding. Kind of a subtle thing. It doesn't go directly to the big riff. The big riff opens up. It has it has bespoke timing in the big riff. There's not a standard set of rhythms it's clinging to.
Yeah.
And the way it kind of soars, it sounds like the Sola Fide riff. It's like it's almost like it's more like one of the DSO climax riffs.
Yeah, and it's really guided by that first lead guitar flourish. Like that first flourish from the lead guitar kind of sets the riff up in a really interesting way, and it becomes the lead voice to the chord backing that ends up following the root notes of that sort of quick pyrotechnic melody there.
Yeah, it's like there's like glissando, right? He's like sort of, it's mostly a single string trem, but he's like sliding between them and letting them overlap in a really subtle way.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Very cool. Yeah. Okay, so now do we talk about the
elephant in the room?
Now do we talk about the elephant in the room?
Who else might be playing? Well, let's hear your next sample, and then we can talk about it with that like fresh context.
All right. So, this one is actually from earlier in the record. This is the second track. In terms of template, it's a lot like the first. So this is also more heavily depressive. Although you will get some more energetic, folky kind of riffing later in the track, but you're certainly going to get some of that big brood at the beginning. This is about just under a minute in.
All right, so listeners, if you're on YouTube or something, pause the video here and comment with what you think we're about to say. Like, who might be the other members of this band? Just go and do that. You know, it's good for our engagement numbers. And now let's talk about it.
Well, the only reason to not list the other members of the band, right, or the main reason I think it has to be in this case is, right, this is a dude who's hooked up to a central label. He himself has an outstanding pedigree, right? This is an original, a guy from the originary days of black and death metal. the reason you don't put the other names of the names of the other guys in this out there is because it would somehow distract from the record, right? All, everything we're about to say here is speculative.
Yes, we have absolutely no evidence or insider information for this. This is gut feeling and listening. Yeah.
And it's just, if you are going to have the anonymous lineup, I think, part of the game is we get to speculate, right? So when, you get that sort of rolling build and the melody is carried by this sort of like droning single string work, and underneath it, right, what makes it sound big are the changes in the bass, like not bass in the sense of literal instrument, but like a lower trem line that's filling in the under structure, and the bass is going right? It's turning around in a way that is so epic that everyone thought it was too obvious until this guitarist started doing it all the time, right?
And then, at the same time that you're listening to that, you're listening to the drum work, which is defined by these... the
halftime drop, right?
Well, I'm going to get into the whole thing. We're doing a trade-off.
Oh,
but
okay.
yes. Yeah, so...
Okay, I see.
No, go for the halftime drop. Talk about that, yeah.
Well, you were still talking about the drums on that section, the rolling section. Go for it.
Yeah. So, and then you've got the drums that are defined by complex ostinato ride cymbal runs, as well as sort of erratic but punctuating tom hits in the middle of these more complex mid-fast double kick beats.
Yeah, like rich melodies being played on toms in black metal drumming. Mm-hmm. A sense that the guy has all the time in the world to deliver these as he's doing up-tempo double pedal bass stuff.
Yeah.
And then, halftime drop.
The halftime drop from the sad, arcing tremolo riff into a more sort of rock-interpreted version of it. Yes.
And the drummer at this point, at a certain points in there, he changes it up. At certain points, he's doing a significant pickup hit right before the the phrase rolls over, right? Like there's an extra bass drum note in each of these that goes like dum da dum da as the measure starts, right? Dum 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 da, something like that. I can't even hum it because I'm not a drummer, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Very signature hit. This sounds like one band, right? It sounds like it's literally both core members of Migla.
Yes, it absolutely does. It was interesting because we picked up on different things. We both thought that what screamed to me was the drums and what screamed to you was the guitar work. For me, I don't know when it was. It might have been this track in particular, but listening to that, it's like this is either Dark Side from Migla or it is a guy who is perfectly imitating all the intricacies of his style.
Yeah, I heard it in the guitars, and then as I listened more, I was like, "Oh shit!" The drummer is just doing that. It's I was like, "Damn, those are really good drums." I was like, "Oh." I think I had some there are a few candidates for who could be playing the guitar or whatever you're thinking about, and then just like, oh god, yeah. Well, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck.
No, man, but I was questioning the guitar thing, but as soon as I re-listened to that big like epic melancholic riff there, I was like, oh, that's like that specific interval choice is like a Migla signature.
Yes, exactly. No, the riffs aren't. So this is a cool thing. There are very few to zero Migla riffs on here. Mm-hmm. what there is this guy's ear all over it. His ear for tonality, and in particular for sticking the landing on certain massive Dorian scale tectonic shift ideas. And just in the idea of like putting sustained rolling kind of stable single string lines with these big changes under them. And then he'll play. People often compare Migla to Swedish Black Death bands, right? But they'll compare him to Sacramentum because of the ear for consonant melody, right?
Yeah.
What this record proves is that this guy was listening really seriously to that entire scene, and especially to Sorhin. Or not especially to, but including that, right? To the degree where he's playing into the Swedish style.
Yes.
Like,
exactly.
He's writing riffs that, the riffs that really sound Swedish on this, and there are a lot of them, could have been written by a guitarist from that original Black Death scene. And it just shows he has such a signature in his two main bands, right? You might just be like, is this guy just the way the guy plays? And this is an astonishing answer to that question, which is like, well, no, he can do this too if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, the really remarkable thing about this, if we are correct, is, like you said, there's basically no Migla riffs, but it's just, there are idiosyncrasies to his style that scream it, and what that means is, the only way you pick up on that is, one, listening to a lot of Migla, which of course we both have, and two, listening to all the other bands that try to sound like them and fail. And, like, proving that if this is M from Migla, he still has something that nobody else has unlocked. You know, he's got certain interval ideas that nobody else has figured out how to make work.
And you can actually hear it on the last Migla record, right? On Age of Excuse, he starts playing stuff that sounds more Swedish. And not flowery Sacramentum stuff, but much more severe storming type Swedish melodies. And so this really goes with that. And so some of the squalling kind of layered disharmonic lead stuff, lots of it on Age of Excuse, and lots of it in their sort of test run band Kriegsmaschine. There aren't any Migla riffs on this record, but there are a lot of Kriegsmaschine riffs. And by riffs, I mean not riffs. Like the parts that just have the dissonant arpeggios that you were linking to Orthodox are like the Kriegsmaschine sort of mid-tempo jam black metal version of Orthodox.
Yeah. You see, for me, the Orthodox comparison, what I was really getting at was... in particular Onskapt, which is like the only case of like an Orthodox band I have more experience with than you, like of all of them. Just because Onskapt tends to be a little bit more mid-tempo and spacious with their arrangements. They were never really as interested in this super dense, like high technicality stuff, nor were they totally like Eosoth in like trending towards Bloodos Nord. There's a lot of stuff that just sounds like very ugly, weird black and roll stuff in Onskapt.
Rolling, steady groove mid-tempo.
Yeah, there's a lot of groove in Onskapt, which is one of the cool defining features. But yeah, so speaking of all this, and especially speaking of just guitar technique and different things you could do with it, I want to go to the song Doodspredikanten. Now here I can hear the Sorhin coming out a little bit more in some very strange harmonic ideas that are happening. Most of this record is more consonant, but honestly one of its strengths is how it manages to balance that consonance out with really not just like crusty, gnarly, chromatic stuff, but like deliberately difficult, true black metal riffing. So most of this passage is going to be dominated by a riff that I'm kind of associating with Volknut, of all things. It's got this very gray, foggy quality, sort of a neutral tone you can't really wrap your head around. But here's where all the little extra bits add. That really rich drum performance. The vocals get a little bit more theatrical here, which I really like. And there's this super cool, weirdly technical bass line that you're going to hear pop up that just ended up becoming like one of the most charming parts of the record for me. So you were about to spurg out on that last riff. Go ahead, black metal guy.
Yes. This one, yeah.
Well, what about it?
Oh, you got to the end of the sample before me, but I'm finishing it now. So, yeah, the one that just came in at the end, right?
Yeah. The huge riff that I actually didn't include all of.
Yeah. Well, we should. Yeah. So there's a lot worth talking about in that one, but that riff as it comes in, right, sounds like Scandinavian folk song. Mm-hmm. And not in a kind of windier Scandinavian folk song via, power metal kind of thing. Yeah. Right? Yeah. It's sort of eerie and lots of half steps.
It's got that longing quality to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also again, just the whole record. Just the one word I'd use is brooding. Just
it is very
steady.
Brooding.
Just I listened to this and walking home in unseasonably cold weather the other week at night, and just listening to this track was like a transporting experience. Like, this might be my favorite track on the record.
Yeah, which is interesting because if you think about it, like, just from a guitar perspective, like, not a lot happens during the bulk of the song. Most of this song hovers just around one or two pretty simple riffs. It's really about giving everything else a chance to breathe.
It's just, yes, it's so much about the, it just breathes authenticity in terms of how the simple riffs in the beginning of the song are delivered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like, so you've got that sort of misty feeling, almost DSBM riff, and it really just hovers on that for a long time. But then...
And it does sprawl out like a Volknut riff. I hear what you mean, Yeah.
It's a Volknut, for me, that record is defined by the very gray feeling of it. It's like deliberately muted in a lot of ways. So a similar thing's happening here, but then it gives so much of a chance for the drums to explore their space, and it's like a groove track. You get down to it, it's about the drums and all their little intricacies. That crazy, I think, string skipping bass line that pops up toward the end of that sample, that's fucking awesome. I love it. You've got this funkadelic ass bass line in the middle of this droning black metal riff, and somehow it complements it perfectly. And then even the vocalist, he's exploring a little bit of his internal Attila there. He's more theatrical, more operatic, and I love hearing that.
The dropout is sick.
Oh yeah. That sort of weird wailing groan that he does there. That's awesome. Why are we not doing that in black metal constantly? Why haven't we learned from Day Mysteries that yes, we should be constantly playing with the vocals and doing weird shit with them?
So, on that note, a point in favor of our conspiracy theory. The weird thing is, right, he's the only listed member, Sigvard/Nattfursth, but this isn't a vocal-focused record.
No, not at all.
Now, I assume he also had some sort of non-quantifiable visionary role in the project, right? Maybe he's played an important role in structuring the songs and arrangements and talking through the ideas and stuff like that. But the vocals are not the focus. It's not like it's his solo thing and he's got some anonymous session players behind him. The vocals are understated. This guy is a demon in Sorhin. And, people's voices change as they get older, but he's still clearly got the capability of making just nasty sounds. They're just mixed really low, and they're delivered with a narrower range. He's delivering them higher. If anything, maybe it gets harder to do piercing screeches as you get older. Here Sorhin has more of a sort of sort of somewhere between the classic Swedish Black Death roar and goblin puke. But it's just really vicious, deranged, mid-range vocals. And this doesn't have that kind of out-front aggression. It's muted, it's in the backdrop, and it's delivered. He's not attempting to make a show of himself, which suggests that, if anything, he's showcasing the musicians, right? So, it's, which again just goes to suggest that this isn't just hired guns he brought in for the session. In terms of what you're saying about we also do get a bit of so what's distinctly Sorhin-y about this record, right? There are not on this track, as that sort of groove section escalates, right? It shifts from the Volknudi thing to this sort of more sort of descending riff. And at the beginning of that has a sort of cutting edge, gleaming harmonies that you'd associate with Sorhin. They don't crop up a lot on this record, but M knows how to do them, and he throws them in certain points. And the folk riff is very Sorhin. It has the harmonization stripped away from it. So Sorhin would play that whole folk riff with the disharmonic knife's edge harmonies that you heard on the previous riff, right? They play that whole winding folk riff, and it would just sound like it's being made by, spirits of the night, right? What he's done is he's heard the music so closely, he's heard the consonant folk melodies in the Sorhin riffs, and he's heard their rhythmic inflections and turns. That's an insanely good ear. I mean, and to be able to I don't know. Maybe I'm flattering myself here because I hear that in the fucking Sorhin melodies. So let's say to be able to replicate that on a guitar, insanely good ear for it, and to be able to translate it musically and deliver that. So let's get into some more Sorhin related stuff. On the final track, Kala, we get both some very distinct aspects of this sort of folky Sorhin guitar, but blended with an unmistakable kind of M dark side touch. All right. So the real ear grabber there, right, is that winding folk riff. Mm-hmm. That is the thing, and the single thing on this record that's closest to something from like It at Glimmerande Murkrets Dupe. It has these sort of rippling, convoluted kind of Nordic knotwork, is sort of animal form, knot tracery feel of a lot of their riffs. But again, it's like the root notes of the Sorhin melodies, just brought out and clarified. And as it winds up, the way that the rhythm guitar and bass dance around under it and harmonize with it in certain places, fall in certain places, and preserve some rhythm ideas from the earlier section, that's really how the Migla guys do it.
Yeah. Especially, and the way they, at the very beginning of that, the way they kick into the main kind of arpeggiated riff, very kind of abruptly. That's a specific technique they've used several times before.
And before they go into it, right? So a lot of the track is actually this Kriegsmaschine-ish sort of grooving, bum bum, right there, right? You're hitting just a minor 3-2 at the same time as you're doing a minor 6-5 or whatever, right? And so you just get this. It's that thing that we heard on the first sample I pulled. It's like you could just call it the Migla fall off, right? Where you just do a very powerful, simple 2-step descending melody at the end. And the Migla fall-off comes in again in the bass part under the winding Sorhin riff at the end, which is like... And if you think of what that sounds like, it sounds like there are various ways to verify the guitar technique on here. And one way is to say, well, we already have evidence of what what M would sound like if he was playing melodic Swedish black metal, which is a project by one of the Malignant Voices guys, some or all of whom play live in Migla, which is Over the Voids. that guy has these really elaborate flowering melodies. It's a little too sugary for me, to be honest, but it's really good. You'd like it.
I was about to say, so I need to check that out.
You would love it. It's very influenced by Olver also.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. It's the guy The Fall, and he plays live in Migla. But it's the way the harmonies work there. These kind of dramatically sweet harmonies that come in and play with the big melodies. It's that's another example of the Swedish stuff getting Miglified. And it could be the Malignant Voices dudes. It could be this guy and the guy, he's in Ashes and Owlswood's Graves, where you can also hear these harmonic techniques.
I've thought about that as a possibility. Maybe it's not the main guys in Migla. Maybe it's the other guys that play live with them,
No, but so I thought about that possibility, but then they would just have their names on it. There's no reason not to have this credit. It's a fantastic album with a veteran vocalist, and there's nothing distracting about it. It's just like, hey, these guys play live in Migla. They're serious players. Here's them doing a session with the guy from Sorhin, right? That's just awesome. That's just really good press, and there's, I don't know. I don't see any reason you wouldn't. The reason you wouldn't do it is if it's the guys who originated that style.
And we are back with Gates of Dawn by Gates of Dawn on a label called Death Hymns that I wasn't really following or didn't know much about until this was brought to our attention.
We did a Death Hymns review the other day. Let me look up which one it was.
Oh, okay. While you're looking that up, I'll do the rundown. So this was a request by one of our highest tier of patrons, the "You Are Literally Danny Filth" patrons.
Oh, it was the last Elegiac record that we covered.
Oh,
yeah.
That was on Death Hymns. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so this he seems so our patron seems to follow this label very closely. He's a fan of a number of projects on this, including a band called Arid, but with an umlaut that has something coming out that sounds pretty cool. But he requested we review this, and I was like, yeah, sure, of course, our patron. And then I sort of bent the knee, and my leather boots and greaves creaked, and my sort of chainmail sort of swished as I knelt in allegiance.
But yeah, so this is a patron request, and it's definitely interesting to hear this because it resonates with some stuff that we've been picking up on in other reviews this year, and also with some bands we reviewed last year. So I guess this is a band that is very outside our wheelhouse in terms of the kind of stuff either of us normally listens to or follows. Very different level of, this is in the scene that we refer to as raw tape black, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of a self-contained world. I guess I'll just lead us off with the clickbait, which is this the Cactaroc of 2022?
Was that rhetorical, or are you asking me?
No, I suppose you might as well answer. I mean, we have two people, so I guess you should answer the rhetorical question.
Well, there's nobody else here. I guess you're talking to me. I don't think it's the Cactaroc of 2022. Cactaroc is much more like broadly applicable and accessible, and there's like people I know IRL who like the Cactaroc record. This is a lot more obscure. This is much more like even more dwelling on the internet kind of stuff. That being said, I know why you're asking it, because it is, in a sense, it's really accessible. It's weird, but it's oddly accessible. And it definitely flirts with sounds and imagery that are very appealing, like outside the black metal core fan base.
Yes.
But no, I think that what it's closer to, and we both mentioned in the notes, it's closer to the 2022 Midnight Betrothed, even though it doesn't really sound like it that much. For those who don't remember, Midnight Betrothed did a record last year that we covered that I actually liked a lot. The black metal guy hated. It sounds like chiptune black metal anime soundtracks. So, take
but
that
not
for
anime soundtracks I like.
The wrong anime soundtracks. Yeah.
Wrong anime soundtracks. But the Midnight Betrothed had a lot in common with the Cactaroc, particularly the sort of like anime soundtrack, canned trap beat, emo rap thing.
That's one fucking song on the Cactaroc. The rest of it's just great Slav black riffs. God damn it, dude.
The Slav black riffs were quite good, and so that's what we really mean, is that there's things... This record is engaged in a lot of signaling that I think we find...
not appealing.
Transparent and reprehensible. On the other hand... It's quite good as music.
Yes,
and
it is.
There's like the Cactaroc, right, was a thing that annoyed me aesthetically, but was, if I listen to the record, there's a very authentic, that's a record that has really authentic guitar writing on it, right? Just he's really great at playing Slavic black metal, and it doesn't sound like vampire shit at all. Mm-hmm. This is a record that's playing to type more in a lot of ways, but it's still really, it's not coming from a sort of deep rooting in black metal tradition. However, It is very well done, and it's a pleasure to listen to. So let's start talking about that. So Midnight Betrothed is kind of deliberately soundtracky, deliberately very sort of hook driven and kind of light.
Yeah, those are just raw black metal versions of pop songs.
Right.
Straight up.
This record is not, it's very accessible, but it's not poppy. It's lush and immersive and ceaselessly hammering in a way that's pretty compelling. You know, it's the tones, it's filled with synths. That's one of the things that links it to Midnight Betrothed. Synth is in some sense it's symphonic black metal, but only in the sense that it's using synth as the main instrument. Mm-hmm. It has these big, broad spectrum, heavily layered tones, and it's warm, mm-hmm. you know, in terms of its sound, and emotionally warm, but high intensity at the same time. So one of the sets of reference points here that I'm indebted to, the Midnight Betrothed was mentioned in the YouTube comments. This is on the Excellent Rites of Pestilence channel. It's the full-length stream. And in the comments, the guy from the channel, notes a similarity to Emperor, which, okay, sure, it has keyboards. It's sort of black metal. Growsome Kite, which I'm guessing is closer to this in some ways.
Growsome Kite is the, like, chiptune Castlevania soundtrack druggy black metal shit that's become really popular.
Yeah. And so Midnight, and he mentioned the Midnight Betrothed thing. And someone in the comments there, we always like to shout out the comment section, Laurent Lebec says he compares it to Tangerine Dream era Phaedra covering early Emperor. And there's definitely some kind of cosmiche synthesizer, 70s heavy prog kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, actually, because I read the sort of feature announcing the record on a related website that's linked on the Bandcamp, and he did say that this emerged from when he had kind of moved away from his hometown and he didn't have anyone to play music with, and he was doing a lot of experimentation with his like synth collection. I think he does a lot of analog synth stuff, so it makes sense that he'd be linking back to a lot of like 70s, 80s sort of experimental synth work.
Yeah, and so that's a thing that I've talked about on this show, how, you know, there's a lot of black metal, nowadays black metal, that is highly synth-driven, but seems completely disconnected from, like, any sense of what people who are into synths listen to, mm-hmm. right? Or there's a way of, you know, keyboards got used in symphonic BM as a low-budget substitute for, like, an orchestra, right? And when Emperor first did that, or Kvist first did that, that was, like, cool. And they were using it in a way that was kind of raw and gritty, and different from, like, a synth pop band or whatever, right? But as time goes on, it becomes imitation of imitation of imitation, and it becomes, like, either... and you get the paradigm for black metal synth somehow becomes these kind of... Casio-based things from the 90s, which is very different from what synth people are into.
And it's also very different from what those guys were actually attempting to do with them originally.
No.
It wasn't about the Casio synth sound. It was them trying to be orchestral, but not having the tools for it.
Yes, yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I love the early Emperor, the pre-Night Side, but I love, you know, Emperor or Kvist or all those bands, you know, there's a reason to use keyboards in BM, but it becomes this calcified convention that is divorced from the reasons they were being used in the first place. This guy is actually a synth dude, so he's probably listened to, like, you know, the minimal synth comps that were big in the 2000s. He's probably listened to lots of, like, 80s synth pop and, like, just the whole kind of analog tradition.
He actually has favorite songs off of Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works.
Probably also that. Yeah, shit like that. Yeah, this guy's just listening to a lot of stuff from outside, a lot of sort of full experimental or post-punk music from outside black metal. And he's And there's a way more fleshed out idea of what you can do with synths there, and he's bringing that in. And so that's pretty cool and gives them an interesting angle. However, there is another angle on this record.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I guess we can get into mine. Well, one thing that I wanted to say...
Or should we get to samples first and then use the samples to get to yours?
Well, I guess it kind of dovetails, because what I was going to say is, all of this being said, all of this extra metal influence and stuff, the aggregate result to me is like a really long way around arriving back at like Slavic synth black. You know? Like the bulk of this music is pretty immediately comparable to like some of the more droning Nocturnal Mortem stuff, or Dub Buck, or Kataxu. Usually more minimal.
Oh, I could hear Kataxu. This guy probably loves Kataxu, because that was a blog spot thing that was huge with like cool guys from outside the black metal scene.
Yeah, or like Blood of Kingu and stuff like that.
No, Blood of Kingu is a Senko band with death metal-y guitars.
Yeah, synths too, though, doesn't it?
Maybe, but just in the way that there's like a synth in Hate Forest.
Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, so what I'm getting at is, like, the result of incorporating all these bizarre influences, what is the actual resulting sound? It's something pretty close to, you know, straight up Slavic symphonic black metal from, like, the late 90s, early 2000s. But then there's something highly specific that I want to talk about. So we're going to listen to this sample, and then I'm going to show you guys the comparing sample from this other band. We're going to do it very quickly because I want it fresh in your head, because I am fucking amazed that this guy is, I will put money down, a huge fan of this other artist. But let's listen to the beginning of the first kind of real song, Glowing Gray... Excuse me. Glowing... It's hard to say. Glowing Gray Gaze. So let's listen to the beginning of this, and then I will introduce something real quick, and you will be blown away by the similarities. So that is actually really cool. You've got the sort of racing drum machine and the cool, simplified pagan black metal riff with those elaborate layers of synths all over it, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's listen to a band called Helveto that I like a lot.
Yeah.
And we're going to go to an early record by Helveto, the record In Arms of Kirpian Phantom, and let's listen to a sample off Color of My Blood. Can you tell me the difference between these two pictures?
Gates of Dawn turns the drums down a little bit, gives them a more solid sound, smooths it over, simplifies the layering a bit, and boosts the keys in the front to do a recurrent pop hook. But no, that's the like. That is to a T the same. This Gates of Dawn has streamlined the Helveto thing and made it more sort of palatable for a mass audience.
Literally,
a small mass, but for more people. For more people than schizophrenics in Eastern Europe.
Seriously, 3 seconds into Glowing Gray Gaze, I was like, "This is Helveto." I texted you the moment it hit, and I was like, dude, this is just Helveto. And then I started frantically looking for comparison samples to throw into this. So there's stuff that's undoubtedly even closer to that I could have found, but Helveto's discography is like 30 fucking albums, so I just went with something relatively comparable. But the whole idea is the same. The kind of racing blast beat, the sort of elaborate chorded stuff going on the guitars, but still relatively simple riffs, technically, and then the focus being on the layered symphonic elements. Now, like you said, Gates of Dawn strips it down, simplifies and streamlines it, but the essence of the idea is there, and it is so close that my hand to God, I will contact this guy behind this project, show him this, and I will put money down. I will put fucking money down. There is no way I am wrong about this one.
No.
Or we found a guy that arrived at exactly the same idea somehow, you know?
It's interesting. So, so what do we, the question is, what is the, what's the, right, there are two ways of looking at what's going on here. So the spicier or more cynical take, which I guess I've already somewhat suggested, is this is underground mining. That is, you find something deep within the most bizarre recesses of committed subculture, and you produce a version of it that is more now and that will appeal to people from outside that subculture. That said, the more charitable reading, and it's possible that both of these exist at once, right, is that this guy's doing a service, right? This is an unknown project. Perhaps in future interviews he'll call attention to his influence by them and point them out to us and to people as a band worth paying attention to. In a sense, a project like this revives the memory of old stuff, right? Or it could. And it's And the streamlining has something to it, right? The Helveto points at this in every way, points at this idea of like black metal as this densely woven, ecstatic, textural kind of stuff. But there's certain things about the way it's produced, certain artifacts of the time and the very limited resources this guy had, like janky digital production, that just make it a lot more difficult to listen to. To some degree that makes it cooler. To some degree that actually just makes it worse. Right? You know what I mean?
No,
Whereas,
I think
like this can be listened to in the Helveto points at electronic music. This can be listened to as one listens to really intense electronic music, and that's cool. Like as kind of harsh as I'm being to some degree, I may come back to this record a lot.
Yeah, no, I in a very rare move for me, I'm not going to take the cynical take on this, because the reality is, like, Helveto is such an unknown thing. I mean, even for me, I've only listened to a handful of records of his over the years, but they've made a big impression on me. And, you know, presuming this guy has listened to Helveto and has internalized that influence, I think that's a great thing, because I've never really heard anything that sounds like Helveto until this. And I think that that's a really cool idea. I mean, Helveto is kind of like fundamentally just based on the idea of skitzed out, overeducated Graveland, in a sense. You know what I mean? It's like, because the guy behind it, if I recall, he's got like an actual degree in orchestral composition. So
That's bizarre.
Yeah, so this guy is like, I believe,
because it doesn't sound like it.
Well, you can hear it more on the later records where the production's a little bit tighter. But you can tell, especially listening to later albums, like, it's so ornate, and the way the symphonic stuff is assembled is more like classical music. It's not smooth, contiguous melodies. It's, you know, aggressive, clashing musical idea. It's more in the vein of like actual Wagner and Stravinsky, not just like the Xeroxed idea of it we have in the metal scene. Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, I'll have to listen to that again.
Yeah, you'd be really into it. Like, I could turn you on to like a couple records that are a little bit more like metal, a little bit more like Graveland and stuff. You'd probably get really into it. It's a good way to like get yourself into like the really crazy ambitious shit later on. But no, wrapping back around, I think this part is really great by Gates of Dawn. There's definitely moments where I've wanted to listen to Helveto, but it's like just too fucking much sometimes, because it's just this constant assault of so many different layers and so much to keep track of. It's very assaulting.
Helveto is very committed to the old school idea of black metal as inherently assaulting, even if what you're doing is primarily textural.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Now, he's kind of, and that's one of the things that makes it cool, but it also means that it's kind of the internal tension is maybe preventing the full expression of what's really unique about that band.
Exactly. But there's absolutely times where it's like, I want to listen to Helveto, but if I could just get it like smoothed out and simplified a little bit more, I'll absolutely take that. And here he's doing that, and really he's not losing much in the translation. It's conveying the same atmosphere and the same intensity, just in a way that's a little bit better for everyday listening, you know?
Yeah, which you can't knock. And for kind of transforming environments in the way that ambient music does. Helveto is it's there, it's assaulting you, it's an independent entity. This, right, Gates of Dawn sort of can seep into and reshape an environment or an experience.
Yeah.
The best electronic stuff. And, you know, an interesting thing also, there may be fewer layers here than in the Helveto, but there are a lot. And the way he's mixed it is really good at suggesting depth. Like, there's like burbling kinds of, there's like this constant burble of frenetic noise just under the most clearly discernible lines, right? Like, we can pick up on the main synth hook, we can pick up on the kind of rhythm guitar underneath, and then there's just all this other shit. So let's get into Predatory Gods. So This track has, your sample had more of an ecstatic vibe with that pronounced hook. This one's a little more stern. And the fact that he can nail a feel like this makes me, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, now I'm going to listen more, now I'm going to listen with more open ears, even to the most deliberately kitsch parts, like the end of that last sample you played, right, where it kind of goes, like almost sounds like Calypso or whatever. Right? It's so this track is here is Stern Gates of Dawn, and the melodies are very simple. So focus on the just massive layering. So, was that a glockenspiel?
No, I don't know. I don't know what instruments are.
I don't either. I only have a vague idea of what one might be. But basically, there's a really cool thing. So the simple flute melody, right? He emphasizes the flute, the synth flute, as an instrument, right? Mm-hmm. Which definitely connects it to those Slavic symphonic black bands you were talking about. But do do do. Do, 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 do. So kind of a filmy mood music kind of melody, right? Maybe a little bit archaic kind of sounding. And it's doubled by this bell sound under it that's like, or maybe it's supposed to be like a harp or a kithara or something, like a lute. But it's got this more percussive, almost bell chiming string synth under it that's really cool. And that whole sequence is, it's kind of like summoning. It's a lot like the early Martial Industrial type stuff. Mm-hmm. But under all that, there's a couple other things going on. There's this insistent rhythm guitar pulse to it. He's like, it's not trem. There's like this pulsed rhythm guitar happening that sounds like it's rhythmically punctuated in some way.
Well, are you talking about the end after the rhythm switch where he's doing that like down-picked riff?
No, in the din that of the continuous thing that happens for most of that sample. Maybe it's a sound like this music creates ghost sounds, which is really cool. So I can't tell. Maybe he's just trem picking. Maybe it's just like one note watery trem picking. but or one chord trim, but it sounds like there's funk picking or something. Like it sounds like my brain is hearing like Thelahun Ginjit by King Crimson. Like he's just doing this kind of like rapid like frip guitar, like you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like,
and that's possibly just like the time I thought I was still hearing I was still hearing sort of like harsh agro-tech techno, and it turned out to be the subway extraction vent.
well, I mean, that's one of the cool things about lo-fi recording. I mean, as much as I tend to shit on sort of artificial lo-fi recording, you can get good stuff out of it, like just those sort of ghost artifacts that pop up from packing lo-fi recording with way too much reverb and delay. You know, you get the waveforms kind of bouncing off each other, creating harmonics that aren't actually there. I mean, I've done music like that you've listened to, where you were like, "What's that weird harmonic thing you're doing?" It's like, no, I just threw a bunch of reverb patches on it. That's why it sounds like that. But I get what you mean. Well, you see, this is where we get into one of the other theses I have about this record, which is like kind of any single point of it points very directly at something else. Like,
yes.
Like, for instance, my first sample, obviously the Helveto thing. Here, like, the whole flute melody and the way everything wraps around that is extremely summoning. I actually hadn't read that in your notes, but yeah, that's totally like a summoning thing. So, in one sense, I mean, you can take that a couple different ways. You can say dismissively, oh, this is like a pastiche, but, I mean, you know, pastiche is kind of its own art form, and if it all works together naturally... No, you get what I'm saying. It's like, if all these influences, these distinct referential influences, interlock and interact with each other in a way that feels very contiguous, that is something significant in and of itself. It means there's a guy here who's realizing certain connections that maybe other people haven't.
Yeah, that's true. And I think this is not a stitched together patchwork of stuff. It is constantly signaling, like directly referencing some cool reference point, right? Mm-hmm. So that is the part of it that's very internet, right? Although I suppose we're very internet. We're on the internet. We're a podcast. But and we also constantly like making reference points to things that are cool. So, you know, or that we think are cool.
Yeah, but we're not released on vinyl yet. We're going to hit up Death Hymns and have him put out a 3x 12-inch release of one of our episodes on vinyl.
Oh, God, every one of them. I want every one of them on box. But, like, so it's not... So, although there is this referential thing, it is all woven together, and he is hearing those interrelationships between these influences. I think that's indisputable. One indication of it is, you know, honestly, even the fucking logo relates to the sound, right? Mm-hmm. A word you could use for this that we've used for a few times for different bands, such as Mongrel's Cross, but like horror vacui, right?
Yeah.
Any space that can be filled will be filled, and that is a name that it can be referred to like the ornamentation on cathedrals, but it's originally used to refer to the kind of Norse knotwork and tracery stuff, right? Which his logo is like, has a super exaggerated version of that then like blends into like flame, and actually Gothic cathedral kind of stuff at the top of it. Yeah. So this is it's a very it's a lot of stuff being woven into a very complex, homogeneous texture, which sounds paradoxical, but you know what I mean. Like,
no. I mean, complex, homogeneous texture is black metal. You know?
Yeah.
Okay, so my next one, Encircled by Roses. So the opening of this is going to be a little bit simpler than the first sample that I took. So the opening of this is very Midnight Betrothed. It's kind of goofy. I've got affection for it, but I can definitely acknowledge it as goofy. The rest of the sample is interesting because, you know, drums and guitars really take a backseat to a really intricate, cool interaction between a flute synth and a clean guitar. Again, very Helveto, this sort of like dueling lead instrument thing that isn't really adhering to the time signature of everything going on under it. And this really, I like the rest of this record, but this is one of those instances that proves to me that, okay, this guy can really take this to the next level. We know that he can write solid pagan black metal riffs. We know he can do the sort of Slavic synth black thing. But this, to me, is evidence of a spark of something really special in here. So I guess it's not a flute and a clean guitar. It's a flute and a piano. It's just, it's hard to tell because it's buried in so many layers. But I really like the constant interaction between these symphonic voices, this sort of dueling lead thing, but presented in kind of a legitimately sophisticated way. Obviously, so the opening is like, okay, that's a little bit silly. But then when we get into the main bulk of the music, okay, there's something cool going on here. The idea of dedicating this big block of time to just this very granular, very direct interaction between these two instruments, with everything else reduced to kind of a backing motif. And I think that's kind of exciting.
That's, yes, the ability to step out from the dense textures and put something in the foreground when he wants to.
Exactly, because I think that, especially in this, this scene that this project is somewhat related to, this, Instagram kind of tape black stuff, there is a tendency to rely on textures, which, of course, we love textures. They're important to black metal. However, there's certain ways of doing textures. There's certain big chords that you can do that are always going to sound fucking good. At this point, with access to the internet, we know how to make something sound like, like a Seigneur Voland worship thing, and just make it sound good, make it sound enjoyable. But
throw some unique reverb on there in a way that makes it different from the other guy's reverb.
Exactly. But to pull back on that and to decisively say, okay, we've got these two lead instruments and everything is going to rest on the interaction between these two, that's a much more ambitious move than most of these guys do. And it really kind of like puts himself out there, because that can fail. That has a risk of failure in the way that the more textured stuff really doesn't. And I think that's significant.
Yeah, and there's a ballsy move in having it be flute, right?
Yeah.
I'm going, like, the infamous weak link of many a black metal album is the synth flute. And there are places where I'm looking for the flute to hit, right? You know, there are certain parts where I'm like, you know, at a Crota record, I'm like, oh yeah, here comes that flute, right? But it's but even there's plenty of, you know, questionable flute moments, right? It's a difficult sound to make convincingly on, you know, any kind of synth. It's inherently everyone will associate it with goofy video game soundtracks or whatever, right? But to hang the weight on putting that in the foreground is cool, and he does that throughout the record again and again. He uses the flute as the lead. Mm-hmm. So let's see. How else do we get to the next sample? Well, there are a couple ways. Why don't we just go? You said like big blocks, right? We've talked a lot about the solidity of this music, kind of, right? It kind of becomes a lot of music, especially black metal, is a process. This music often feels like material, right? Or like literal atmosphere in the sense of like mist of certain kind, like strange glowing mist hanging around you, right? Mm-hmm. It's not moving in the way that a lot of black metal songs drive forward, even stuff that's very atmospheric. So let's listen to Attics of Mind. It's a kind of intensity, and it's intensity not as, you know, thrust or frenzy or drive. Its intensity just is this, like, heavy hanging material presence.
I don't know, man. Pan flute might be going a little bit far for me.
Yeah. Is there a like there's like a flute? There's like a cutoff within the domain of flute.
Yeah, within woodwinds, there are places man dare not tread.
But what if he is a sort of a placid but mischievous fawn in the gambling about in the misty vales? It's so as the pan flute. It is a pan flute at the end. You're right. But it's a lot of the tones on this. They're really not. I mean, really not intended as substitutes for the original tones. The sound that's a synth pan flute, and it exists within its own sort of vocabulary in weird kind of fringe digital synth music, right? So a synth pan flute is and it's a particular kind of spiraling line, and it's really similar to a couple of the more martial industrial tracks by Coil. In particular, like I'm thinking of like a particular track or two from the end of Horse Rotorvator, I believe. Let me double check that right now. I did not look it up ahead of time. No, sorry, it's got to be the end of Scatology. It's like it's either the first 5 minutes after death or the other one that sort of pairs with it, which is no, fuck. I just what even? Hang on. Just honestly.
Nobody fucking cares. Nobody fucking cares, dude.